Hello, I'm Drew Christie in the philosophy department. The first thing to say is that all that snow you see up there is causing some problems. So there are some active leaks and some buckets around. So yes, ice dams are a problem, and be careful where you walk, etc. There may be emergency provisions. I'd like to begin by thanking our guest speaker for braving the snowiest winter any of us in snowy New Hampshire can remember. So thank you for being here, and you were very lucky in your choice of flights. So it's my pleasure to introduce an extraordinary legal rock star. Chief Judge Diane P leads one of the most impressive groups ever assembled, the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. In addition, Chief Judge Wood, the court includes Richard Posner and Frank Estabrook. Every law student in the country spends hours listening to their music, reading their opinions. My sons, both law students who are not easily wowed, were greatly impressed that their dad got to introduce such a legal celebrity. In addition to being Chief Judge of the Seventh Circuit, Diane P is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Chicago Law School. Chief Judge Wood attended the University of Texas at Austin and also got her JD in Austin in 1975. After graduation from law school, she clerked for Judge Irving Goldberg on the Fifth Circuit and for Judge Harry Blackmun of the United States Supreme Court. In 1980, she began her career as a legal academic at Georgetown Law Center. She moved to the University of Chicago Law School in 1981, serving as a full-time professor until 1995. In 1990, she was named to the Harold J. and Marion Green Professorship in International Legal Studies, becoming the very first woman to hold a named chair at the law school. From 1993 until she was appointed to the Seventh Circuit, she served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice. Chief Judge Wood is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, that's why she's here, and is on the Council of the American Law Institute. She enjoys playing the oboe and English horn in several area amateur orchestras. I just heard they had a rehearsal last night, which is why you came in this morning. I am delighted to welcome an impressive Renaissance person.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. And you know, I'm really one of these people who never quite can decide what I want to be when I grow up. And so I keep all options open. And there is no better place to keep all options open than the amazing job I've had for nearly 20 years on the Federal Court of Appeals. Because if variety is what you like, variety is what we get. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about it as time goes on. But I'm really delighted to be here to talk to you about the humanities, which is just a huge interest of mine. The subject couldn't be more important, but it is one that often gets overlooked or somehow minimized in public discussions. So I applaud the University of New Hampshire for having this Center on the Humanities. You are not alone. There are groups in other universities. There are councils on the humanities in virtually all of the states. And they're all trying to, I think, really live a life and allow others to see how the humanities fit into life. Drew mentioned that I am a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. One of the more interesting things I was able to do in that capacity was to sit on a commission on the humanities that the Academy convened a couple of years ago, and I'll be talking about that off and on. We issued a report entitled The Heart of the Matter, and there's a video that goes along with it. I think you can probably find them both on our website. And the report and the video really capture beautifully what we thought was the essence of our shared conviction, that every human being is multidimensional throughout life. Everyone should be exposed to all types of learning: humanities, social sciences, hard sciences, the arts. And so I'm going to explain how we came up with that commission, what sorts of topics, but not only the commission, but others have been looking at, and where we're going with things. So let me begin with a little bit of history. And I might mention, by the way, that on our video for our report, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said, it's almost always helpful to begin with a little bit of history if you want to understand the present and if you want to understand where you're going in the likely future. So actually now more like a decade and a half or so back, there was a report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. And it borrowed its title from a BBC HBO biography of Sir Winston Churchill. And in this report, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine called for the United States to recommit itself to serious mathematical and scientific education. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences, among others, heard that call, picked up on it, and it has sponsored a variety of projects on scientific topics: global nuclear future, climate change, the need to recommit the country to advanced basic scientific research. I'm going to add parenthetically that, somewhat to my surprise, some people contest whether this should be going on. And in my home state of Texas, there has been what I regard as a somewhat unfortunate tension between the former governor of the state and the president of the University of Texas at Austin, the former governor taking the position that nothing was worth doing if it didn't lead immediately to a patent, and the president of the University of Texas at Austin, Bill Powers, saying, wait a minute, aren't universities the very place where basic research should be going on, research for which we don't really know what the final utility will be, what the final applications will be, but they advance human knowledge. And certainly that would be my view, that this is very important to do. So the Academy has always recognized, and I think our society, maybe just go back to the late 1950s, that the so-called STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math, are important. But they don't stand alone, and that's where we begin to come into this humanities. There was an interesting monograph that a couple of my scientific colleagues there wrote called Science and the Educated American, a Core Component of a Liberal Education. So think of that term, a liberal education. I would suppose all of us here probably think the same thing when we hear that term. The idea of a liberal education has been around in our country since the founding. It reflects the kind of classical, well-rounded education that Thomas Jefferson was hoping for when he founded the University of Virginia. And the word liberal in this context connotes comprehensiveness, it connotes freedom to explore, it actually connotes a shared background, if you will. I don't want to use the word common curriculum in the current narrow, contentious way, but a shared base of knowledge that all have. And that common fund of knowledge shared by all citizens was thought by the framers of our Constitution to be essential to the proper functioning of the kind of representational democracy they were trying to adopt in 1787. Even though you don't always hear it, I think the same spirit lives today in people from every part of the political spectrum. And in that sense, it was very gratifying and reassuring when we sat down to do this report on the humanities at the Academy, that we had been asked to do so by a bipartisan set of people from Congress, one Republican and one Democrat from the House, one Republican, one Democrat from the Senate. And they said, could you tell us maybe the top 10 things that we could do that would enhance both the humanities and social sciences in the United States going forward in the 21st century? And so we did, and had this commission. And the commission has, since the report was issued, been hoping that a national conversation on these topics could be jump-started, and it indeed has been. And one of our big messages was that it is a fallacy to think in either-or terms. It's not science or the humanities. People need two legs to stand on the whole and by and large, and they need both science and the humanities. Scientists need the humanities, humanists need the sciences. I'll just give you one little anecdote from my own life. This is an illustration of the fact that you just never know what you're going to pick up when you get a set of briefs. So it turns out there has been a real issue brewing in the Great Lakes region because the Army Corps of Engineers, back around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, decided to create a system of locks that separated, well, that caused the Chicago River to flow backwards. The reason being that Chicago was getting its water from Lake Michigan. It was also dumping all of its waste in Lake Michigan, so they wanted the lake to stay clean. So they create all these locks. The locks are there. But what that did is it geologically joined the Great Lakes Basin with the Mississippi River Basin, because the Chicago River, through all these various locks, winds up back in the Mississippi River. At the same time, in the early 1960s, a bunch of fish farmers down in Mississippi were bothered by algae. And so they thought, well, we have the solution for that. Let's import Asian carp. And they'll eat up all the algae, which they were certainly happy to do. The Asian carp not only ate up the algae, but they somehow escaped the fish farms and swam over and got into the Mississippi River and have been moving their way up the river ever since, to the point where now, but for several electric barriers that are in place in both the canals and rivers near Chicago, there's a fear that they may break into the Great Lakes. And of course, as you know from other historical events, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Erie Canal, et cetera, through man-made interventions, once you're in one of the Great Lakes, you're in all of them. And so you have really done something that we don't know what the end of the story would be, except to say the statistics I saw in this case suggest that if you do just a fish kill toward where the Mississippi River joins the Chicago River, something astonishing like 90% of the biomass in the river is carp. It's silverhead carp and bighead carp, because what they've done is they've eaten all of the plant matter that support the bottom of the food chain. So with the bottom of the food chain killed out, the top of the food chain never comes into being. And so thus the carp. Now, there are also some amazing videos you can watch of the Asian carp leaping through the air and people whacking at them. But anyway, we, your basic 22-year-old guy, dressed in armor, sort of flailing around with the sword. But anyhow, there's a lawsuit that was filed, enter me, a lawsuit was filed by 5 states and an Indian tribe seeking as relief an order from the court requiring the Corps of Engineers to restore the hydrological separation between the Great Lakes region and the Mississippi River Basin. And so if you're thinking, why does she know all about Asian carp? It's because I had to learn not just about the biological carp. There are things in this case about whether environmental DNA is a reliable technology. There are things in this case about whether even if we completely sealed it off at Chicago, since there's something like 35 different sites from Minnesota on around to New York where the carp could break in, maybe we would have done nothing. So you actually have to understand something to deal with these cases and understand institutions as well. It turns out there's a 23-agency binational Asian Carp Coordinating Commission. And so they meet constantly and decide, what are we going to do now about the carp? As far as we know, they haven't. As far as we know, everything that's been done is working so far, but it's not guaranteed to work forever. So I've actually written 2 opinions about the Asian carp, of all things, and it's just a good way of showing that if you're going to be a citizen in a very complex society, you ought to feel pretty comfortable with both science and the humanities. That's my message. So I think a lot of people in the abstract are fine with the humanities. It's just that when they look at their pocketbooks, maybe not so fine. And that's where the news is much more sobering. You probably know this, that the humanities receive scant financial support from the public sector, particularly from the federal government. In each of the last 2 years, I have to say I find these numbers shockingly low. Congress appropriated $146 million to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and actually then reduced that further to $138.4 million in 2013 after sequestration. So, perspective, that's out of a total federal budget for that year that involved $2.77 trillion in revenue and $3.45 trillion in expenditures. So NEH is, whether you like it, whether you don't like it, is almost beside the point. $143 million. They're not going to do anything with that amount of money, pro or con. So that's not what's driving anything. And it seems to me there are so many things actually that they do which are unambiguously good. There has to be some way of improving that. They spend money, they give states money to use for various programs, and at that point the programming discretion is in the hands of the states, not in the hands of the federal government. They spend money on preservation and access, they spend money on research programs, they're digitizing things, which is certainly a very helpful thing. For the last couple of years, they've had a program called Bridging Cultures, initiatives to support projects and programs highlighting cultural diversity. That program got a whopping $9 million in fiscal 2014. So is it a help? Absolutely. If somebody's giving you $9 million, you don't turn it away, but it's a very small amount of money for a country of our size. So that's not the only thing that's spent, though. As is often the case in our country, looking again solely at the public sector, maybe the federal government isn't even the primary place to look. Maybe it's really the states. And you do have to look at the states to get a complete picture. Every state, I hope, and certainly you can look at the state constitutions, every state is publicly committed to a quality education for its population. How that gets done is obviously a matter of great debate. And I have actually seen some of this on the ground since one of my children is now a 10th grade teacher in an exceptionally disadvantaged area of Chicago of the topic of human geography, which I didn't even know was a topic. But anyway, it's a very interesting topic, in fact. But what she's dealing with, I'm not sure I would be able to deal with. So. Anyway, so education is clearly important. That's primarily the responsibility of the states, and education is the first step toward a healthy development of humanities competence in the country. But education requires advocates, and if we don't have adults who are willing to get out there and advocate, we're not going to structure our education programs in an appropriate way. Communities need to get together. It's not enough for each one of us individually to be sitting around thinking, gee, I wish they taught more foreign language or something. You've got to get that word across somehow. Now, every state in the country, plus the DC, plus the District of Columbia and various of the territories, has its own humanities council, but their support and their activities vary widely. The Kansas State Council is doing a really interesting thing. They've partnered with the group StoryCorps, that those of you who are NPR listeners probably know about, to collect stories of people who were directly affected by Brown versus Board of Education 60 years ago. It seems like that's just great. Make a record of these people while they're still able to speak to what the experience was for them. And you think, how important would those stories be to listen to for people today in Ferguson who are battling their own generation of civil rights problems and challenges? And so it seems to me an unambiguously good program. But as I said, funding varies tremendously. Actually, it's the District of Columbia that's most generous, $17.70 per resident to the Arts Council in 2013. Arizona was 0, and the median was 70 cents per resident. So again, modest support. You've got programs in cities as well. New York Public Library System is outstanding in this respect. But I'm going to focus for just a minute on what we do in Chicago because I have participated in it a number of times, and I think it's a good model for many communities. For a long time now, there's a group called the Chicago Humanities Festival, and they put on an elaborate 2-week program on a broad theme, a theme that's so broad that you can actually put anything you want into it. In 2013, it was What Makes Us Human. That's it. One year it was laughter. In 2014, it was Journeys, and I checked their website. They haven't revealed, as far as I know, what 2015 is going to be. But a tremendous array of people, artists, athletes, business people, public officials, scholars come, and they give a perspective on this topic. And there were more than 100 programs. Hundreds of thousands of people in the community came to these programs, took time out of their weekdays, took time out of their weekends, came to the programs. It's phenomenally successful, and it creates a public conversation about the humanities. The festival also sponsors other programs throughout the year, but the real highlight is the 2-week event in the fall. There are smaller scale organizations. Again, in Chicago, there's a group called the Chicago Children's Choir. They bring music education to 65 schools in the city. They run 9 after-school programs. They have a hierarchical structure, so it begins with the young children in the elementary schools, but then you compete for regional, and there's 100-voice choir that has traveled around the world. This reaches children of limited economic means. You don't need to go out and buy an expensive instrument to sing. All you have to do is sing. And it teaches them about art. It teaches them about beauty. It teaches them about community and history, cultural diversity, reliability, discipline. You can't participate in a choir unless you're willing to sing your part when it's time to sing your part, and to be quiet and count measures when it's not time to sing your part. It's a great organization, and honestly, it doesn't take that much in the way of resources. Of course, you want qualified leaders going to the schools, but there are people who are happy to do that. Finally, of course, there is private funding, and this is always important in the United States. Private donors contribute generously to various cultural organizations, whether they're musical, theatrical, community, and that's great. But anyway, most of the support for the humanities in the country is actually coming from, I would think, the universities. And as those of you who are still students maybe haven't been hit up to contribute yet, those of you who are alums will. I have a rather major law school reunion this year, and I've been peppered with letters saying the class gift for the people in 1975, give, 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 give. And people do, and that's good, and that's the money that helps to support the humanities. Now, what are people doing? Are people actually majoring in the humanities? In fact, one interesting thing we did on the Humanities Commission is we asked the question, what are the undergraduate degrees of the people with 1-star general rank and higher in the US military, whatever the equivalent, admirals, whatever, basically the top brass in the military. They are humanities majors, overwhelmingly. They're history majors, they are English majors, they are language majors, they are political science majors. they are not all, you know, mechanical engineering or whatever, not to disparage mechanical engineering, but they are all over the place. One member of our commission, Carl Eikenberry, had been a 3-star general in Afghanistan, had been our ambassador to Afghanistan after that, and was and is a tireless advocate for what Joseph Nye calls soft power, for the United States interacting with people around the world through cultural connections, through language learning. When he was in Afghanistan, he helped to spearhead a project to rebuild their archaeological museum. People loved it. And this is a man, by the way, who's no slacker, because at some point along the way, he managed to become fluent in Mandarin Chinese. He also mastered the Afghan language. So when he said, you know, it's one of my husband's favorite phrases, it's not bragging if you've done it. He's done it. And so he's entitled to say whatever he wants to about it. And one can certainly ask the same question about members of Congress. You actually wind up with the same answers. You know, the majors in the humanities permeate the institution. It's not every single person, but these are the backgrounds that give you the intellectual flexibility to grow with the times, to move into niches that no one else has even realized exist yet. And so, you know, again, I think if you look at it carefully, there's a lot of good news about it. I regard that as good news. Students don't major in the humanities as much now as maybe they once did. I looked at those data, but they are in fact taking humanities courses while they're majoring in something else. And so the number of humanities faculty in US universities is going up if you look at a time between, say, 1999 and 2012. You know, just for the record, I'm never sure what to describe my college major as, because it was actually Plan 2 at the University of Texas. And Plan 2 was kind of do whatever you want to do. But what I wanted to do was comparative literature. So I kind of satisfied the requirements for an English major, plus I did French and German and Latin. That was my path to law school, so to speak. But anyway, once people are out in the real world, the humanities are impossible to avoid. Everyone has to be able to read competently and to understand what they're reading. Everyone. I don't care if you're a scientist, a business person, a teacher, a plumber, whatever you are, everyone needs to be able to communicate in writing. Those skills atrophy at your peril. And I'll say from my perspective, another type of case that I see all too many of are contract disputes. You think, well, okay, it's a contract. What does the contract mean? Well, contracts are often made when people just exchange, say, a series of emails. How about this? Okay, but let's modify it that way. Okay, you know, so you'll have a series of emails. When people don't know how to write well, they don't express themselves clearly. And when they don't express themselves clearly, you can wind up with two different understandings of what has happened. And no one's being bad about this or anything. It's just two different understandings. So it winds up in the hands of somebody like me saying, what are you talking about? You know, how do you disambiguate these things? Who, you know, and in the end, sometimes you have to resort to burdens of proof. You know, if I really can't figure it out, then I'm going to rule against the person who had the last word, or against the person who, the contra proferentum principle is what that's called. But basically, you have to have a set of rules that say, what do I do now, since I still really can't figure out what went on? But a big part of the problem is ambiguity. And people who can write clearly and express themselves don't suffer from that as often as people who don't know what they're doing. Another thing that I think really tells us that you cannot escape the humanities, and I'm using this broadly, is self-governance. Communities at whatever level you want, local, regional, state, national, need to govern themselves. And people need to understand how that happens, because they will not be satisfied and effective citizens if they can't. So, here we have, I can see it's actually happily snowing away more. In Chicago, mayors have lost elections for not plowing the snow effectively and quickly enough. This famously happened in 1975 when Jane Byrne won the mayor's race because the incumbent mayor had taken too blasé an attitude about the importance of moving the snow out of the way. Potholes, a big problem in Chicago. Maybe you don't have them here in New Hampshire, but maybe you do. Mortgage foreclosures leading to blighted neighborhoods, gangs operating open-air markets, areas of town where good grocery stores refuse to locate. There are 1,001 real-world problems. And if people know what they're doing, they know who to call, they know who the person in charge of that problem is, then they may solve the problem, or a community may get together and try to solve that problem. One of the exercises that a group that works with elementary and secondary school students that I'm involved with in Chicago has a program each year where they take middle school students and they ask each group of students to identify a particular problem in their community and figure out how they're going to solve it. And so then they come and they make a presentation at the end, and I've participated in listening to them. First of all, they're cute as can be. It's just amazing. And sometimes it's as simple as, one group of kids said, well, in our school, there's no quiet place to go. And so we went to the principal and we went to the school board and we said, and we figured out a room that would be a good room to do this, and here's the room that's going to be the quiet room now. Another group of kids, I mentioned mortgage foreclosures, happened to live in a neighborhood, this was a couple of years ago when this was even worse than it is now, and they said, we're really worried because this neighborhood is so ugly looking and probably dangerous, and the drug dealers try to move into the empty houses, and we want to know how we can do this. They figured out who their alderman was. They checked out what other communities around the country are doing with this. They figured out ways of monitoring, getting a community group to monitor the area. These are middle school kids, and the amazing thing about this program is they felt very empowered. They defined the problem. They defined it as a problem that they could actually affect. They didn't say, we want world peace, or something. They said, a quiet room, or actually the mortgage foreclosure thing was a more ambitious program. But it's a good exercise for them because they discover that they can do it, right? They discover how this kind of process goes on. And I think that's actually part of a general and well-rounded humanities education. There are very good materials around for teaching kids. Retired Justice Sandra Day O'Connor has a website that she is near and dear to her heart called iCivics, and it has modules for learning. And if you can get the kids in front of a computer, it's great. Now, I will say, looking at the kids my daughter's teaching, not every child has access to the digital world yet. In her school, at least, she can use a computer in the classroom. They pass out laptops for everybody, and then they collect them at the end of the class if she wants to do some computer-based learning. But there is only spotty coverage in the homes that the kids come from. So that's another problem. But anyway, iCivics, as I say, is great as far as it goes if you can overcome the resource issue. Writing, again, is very important. People need to understand the structure of their government. In the Seventh Circuit, which covers the states, for those of you who are not legal buffs, of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana, roughly 23 million people. It is what it is. It has everything from very large cities to quite rural areas. We receive, in a given year, 3,000 appeals that are filed, 3,000 matters that are brought before us, of which many can be disposed of pretty quickly. Somebody filed it too soon, or they just are confused about what they should be doing. But the point I want to make right now is, of those 3,000 filings, 55% are what we would call pro se. They are filed by an individual acting without a lawyer. So I spend a lot of time, I'm going to have to do this on Tuesday. I'll read through 15 or so of these things. Sometimes they're handwritten. People are trying to tell you what's wrong with them. You're trying to figure out, what happened. Is there a legal issue here? If so, does it belong in federal court? Or are you really complaining about something that belongs in state court? Some of them have real problems. Some of them don't. Some of them are deranged. Some of them are, you see everything, but and then some. But the fact is, to have their voice, these are people who need to know how to write. Inmates in prison file endless things. Some of them are excellent writers. I look at it and I think, what a shame, that you didn't channel yourself in a more productive way, because here you are in prison for whatever and may stay for a long time. And it's plain when you read it that this is an intelligent person whose story you're listening to. And some of those cases have merit as well. So people really, on a very pragmatic level, need to know how to read and write. So let me just wrap up with saying I don't want to leave you with the message that I think the humanities are all about practical things, although they are about practical things. At one of our meetings, one of my fellow commissioners, John Lithgow, the actor, was talking about his own experience as a child, and he wrapped it up with this thought. He said, I got out of bed in the morning and went to school for the art. I stayed there for everything else. So that's kind of cool. People like art. Beauty makes people feel better about themselves, better about the world around them. That's why cities and states invest in parklands and cleanups and music festivals and art fairs and all sorts of other things. Another member of the commission, my children are not speaking to me yet because I have not gotten his autograph, was George Lucas, who, as he put it, he says, science tells us about the how, but humanities tell us about the why. So I worry that neither of those messages has gotten quite as much prominence as it should. And we had trouble, I certainly hope that you have good ideas about this, figuring out how to deliver the message. Because number one, you don't want to sound apologetic about the humanities, as in, yes, you will in the next 10 years get a job with that English degree that doesn't require looking up at a menu. People all tell this tired old joke, and in fact, English majors do fine, but you don't want to sound apologetic. You don't want to sound whiny. You don't want to come out with something that says, just, throw a whole lot of money at it and everything will be fine, and feel sorry for us because we don't have enough money. We do understand that money is a factor and resources are limited. And nobody, perhaps most importantly, nobody wanted to limit themselves to just the instrumental case for the humanities, because the spiritual case is so powerful and so important. I myself don't worry too much about parity of funding. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, it costs a huge amount of money to conduct medical research. It costs a huge amount of money to conduct various kinds of scientific research, and I don't think you learn very much from parity of dollars. It's really more look at each thing and see what it needs, what could it do. So we are trying to highlight the need for more attention to the humanities and just highlight what people are doing with it and why we need it, especially if we're going to go forward. Why areas like language studies, which is one of my pet things. It annoys me that people think that American students are somehow less capable of learning languages than kids in the Netherlands or something like that. I think that's baloney. But language studies, literature, history, anthropology, philosophy, music, visual arts, on and on. People need to learn all of these things. And they especially need it in the international world. That was goal 3 of our report, which focused on international leadership. It's a cliche, I know, to say that the world is shrinking, or it's flat, or it's porous, or whatever other adjective you like. But it actually happens to be true that we are living in a world where our interactions with others are the rule, not the exception. One of the sobering things, at the beginning of this human geography course, my daughter passed out a blank map of the world and asked the students to write down as many countries as they could think of on this map. Disaster, disaster. Israel was in the middle of Canada. India was nowhere near India. I mean, you know, like big countries. We're not talking about, you know, Kenya or some, I mean, not that that's not big, but people simply, I mean, these are 15-year-olds, right? So maybe there's an excuse, or maybe not. But, you know, you need to know who's out there, what they're doing. People, goods, services, and capital, those are the 4 things the European Union focused on, flow seamlessly across boundaries. That can be great if you're talking about international trade. It can be very scary if you're talking about 9/11. But one way or the other, we're on a global playing field, and we can't sit back and assume that we're somehow immune from it because we're the United States and we speak English and our culture's dominant. None of those things follows from anything else. So I hope that discussions like this, your center, our report, other efforts, really do reawaken people to the richness of the humanities, whether it's the joy of attending Shakespeare in the Park, or the spiritual peace you attain by listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or just the fun of making up a skit to perform. Our collective efforts will bring greater support to the humanities in our various communities, and we will all be the better for it. So I look forward to hearing about what you're doing and to continuing these efforts. Thank you. And I think we're going to have a...
We can take some questions. I
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Judge Wood. I just wanted to reference back to your point about the federal government and state government spending on humanities. And I guess the question is, you know, how can you convince a public and federal and state governments to spend more on the humanities when it's easy to look at, you know, STEM education and say, okay, the outcome is here because there's greater job opportunities, et cetera. You can manage it, or I'm sorry, you could, you know, measure success by looking at an exam. But, you know, how do you convince, you know, the entities that control the money of the value and the importance of spending more time and, you know, spending more money in the education and humanities?
Well, it's a great question. It's one we struggled with, and it's always easy to revert back to the instrumental case. So take language learning. Surely, if we have learned anything since 9/11, we have learned, maybe we haven't, but we should have learned that you need to be able to speak other people's languages to understand what they're doing, what are they thinking, what upsets them, what satisfies them about the way they're interacting with us. And remember, in the wake of 9/11, we discovered that there was an appalling lack of language capability throughout the military, throughout the intelligence services. So you could start with languages and say, you know, we really need this. The truth is, the second point on languages is a commercial point. You're a business person. Suppose you're hiring somebody and you work for Boeing. Boeing sells in every country on the globe, I'm sure. If they have an airline at all, Boeing is competing at least for sales with Airbus. So you have 2 applicants in front of you. One person with a nice college resume and maybe some experience who speaks only English, and the other person speaks, you know, Spanish and, you know, Farsi also. You're going to hire the person who speaks Spanish and Farsi also, because that person is just going to be a more versatile contributor to your business. And this is not just Boeing. I take them because they're a fairly easy example, but there are any number of businesses that have a global presence. Certainly if you have a business in Texas, why would you hire somebody who can't speak Spanish? It's almost self-evident that you would have to do that. So that's the first kind of instrumental case. And expanding it, I would say, you know, you can make the case for particular things probably a little bit more easily. History, I think, is actually incredibly important as well. You know, I could go down the list because many people have different historical horizons. Let me put it that way. I've even thought in the United States that the historical horizon of people who live in states or associate themselves with states who are on the winning side of the Civil War have a shorter historical horizon than people in the southern states. This is because when I moved to Texas when I was 16, between my sophomore and junior years of high school, I was about to take a US history class. And I did take a US history class as a junior in Houston, which was memorable for many reasons, not least of which was my, loosely speaking, teacher who was a track coach informing us one day that the Boston Tea Party took place in the Chesapeake Bay. Whoa. Maybe you need to read that teacher's manual a little better. But the other thing is that as he began the unit on what I just referred to as the Civil War, he didn't even say the war between the states. He said, now we're going to talk about the war for Southern independence. I thought, woo, okay, maybe I'll just keep my mouth shut for a little bit. Little girl from New Jersey who just moved to Texas. And so, and the same thing is true. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait, when George H.W. Bush was president, I happened to be teaching in Paris that summer. I was teaching an international business transactions class. And so I was getting most of my coverage of what was going on from the French press. And the thing that blew me away about that was a lengthy article in a couple, it was not just one, but in a couple of magazines and in some newspapers, I kid you not, going back to Alexander the Great and moving forward from there to understand what the politics of that part of the world were. And I thought to myself, never in a million years would it have even occurred to somebody. You know, we have good I like the New York Times, I read it every day, but it just wouldn't have dawned on people. So it's a different historical horizon. And I think if ours were a little richer, maybe our ideas about the best way to deal with others would be improved in ways that I think I could sit down and talk to Senator Durbin about, or somebody, you know, who at least I know in the Senate. Yes?
I've been interested in talking about the spiritual case or the civic case for the humanities versus the instrumental case. And it seems like one concern is that the instrumental case could always potentially just undermine the spiritual or civic case because you're just getting back to this idea of a sort of a return on investment. Right. And so I wanted to ask how we prevent that from happening, how we make these two cases mutually reinforcing.
Well, again, I think it's hard, but I do know, for example, you can study, and public opinion polls do study general feelings of well-being that people have. You can study things like crime rates. You can study things like, you know, civic participation, how many people show up to vote, how many people do things. And, you know, in Chicago, I moved there in 1981, particularly under Mayor Richard M. Daley, not to be confused with Richard J. Daley, his father. He embarked on a comprehensive beautification program for the city. Parks, flowers planted in the middle of Michigan Avenue, pretty, you know, wrought iron fences along place. I mean, just whatever would work. He, in fact, famously, this was just a hilarious episode that I got in the middle of, shut down the very close-in airport, Meigs Field, and it's now a beautiful park called Northerly Island, has a concert venue on it. Famously, I say, because he tried to shut it down in 1996, that got into the court. Actually, I had that case for a while, but there was a political settlement. But then, having learned his lesson then, he just sent bulldozers out in the middle of the night, and they carved giant X's in the tarmac. And so I said, well, the airport's shut down. he wouldn't fix it, but anyway. So now it's a park. But you do those things to make people feel better about their environment, and I think they're probably in the hands of, you know, accomplished pollsters, there are probably ways of seeing that they do, in fact, have that effect. We know the converse is true, that if people are in, a blasted out, terrible place, that they don't feel good about themselves. When I first became Chief Judge, which, as my predecessor, Frank Easterbrook, was happy to tell me was the day the government shut down, October 1st, 2013, I decided I should visit each of our 7 districts. So we have 3 districts in Illinois, 2 in Indiana, 2 in Wisconsin. So the southern Illinois district courthouse is in East St. Louis, Illinois. East St. Louis is a disaster. It's your urban nightmare. They would be the first to tell you that it is. All of the buildings are boarded up. The crime rate is through the roof. The unemployment rate is through the roof. There's not a statistic. There's no economy. The economy collapsed a generation and a half ago. And people feel terrible about themselves in that place. So it's kind of the converse. You can beautify and bring up, or you can see what places are like where you don't have any of this. And the people are the same, it seems to me. What differs is what collectively they're able to do for themselves.
Now, with the overwhelming majority of our politicians, political leaders, our military officers, and many of the key decision makers being people from the humanities. So where is the pushback against the humanities? Where is it coming from? Who are the people sitting down and making these decisions? And why is it that the humanities is always the first to get the pick, not when you have to cut funds and do other things?
Well, it's another great question. Where are the humanities being cut? I think the first place that I've observed them being cut is actually in the schools. So when a school, I go crazy about this actually as an oboe player, but when the school is facing budgetary challenges, as many, many areas do, what do they cut? They don't cut the football program. They cut the music program. They cut the art program. Because somehow, even though none of the kids on these football teams are really going to make a living playing football either, but somehow the music and art programs seem more dispensable. I would argue they're not, because you get the same benefits out of those programs as you get out of the athletic programs. So I think the schools have seen this, and I don't blame parents for worrying, especially at the higher education level, if you're talking about the between 25 and 30% of our population who go on to some kind of formal education beyond high school. But it's very expensive to have to pay for an education, and people worry, well, is the kid going to be able to get a job? Are they going to, and they kind of get that more. If the kid has an electrical engineering degree, information technology jobs are going begging at this point, and it's a little harder to see. Now, in fact, if you could persuade people to read the data, 5 years out, it's fine. It may take a little more imagination. I have a stepson who's an IT person, so I definitely know what that world is like. But I think where the cuts are coming from is through local budgets, and maybe there's a bigger issue, which is that as a country, unlike our counterparts in most other countries around the world, we've never really seen this as a concern for the federal government. Could the federal government afford more than $143 million for the NEH? Sure. I mean, it would be, shuffling some money around. Suppose you went up to $1 billion. I mean, that is a rounding error at the Pentagon. So seriously, federal courts don't even cost as much as $7 billion, and we're there, worrying about having an extra law clerk for another $10,000. It's just totally ridiculous. But I do think that the serious issue is whether, and one could debate this. I'm not sure I'm going to sit here and tell you what the answer is, but whether we have a national interest in supporting the humanities. We have seen a national interest in supporting STEM. And so we do spend significantly more money on that. I would invite that as a debate, and I think if a consensus came about, maybe not even all the humanities, but maybe languages, there might be less of a strain on the humanities, and these budget cuts wouldn't see the first thing on the cutting floor be the humanities. Also, we'll say, to the extent there's been national policy, I don't know that it's been as well thought out as it might be. So things like No Child Left Behind didn't include civics education. So all sorts of school districts just said, oh, well, I guess we don't have to do that. You know, we'll teach, you know, reading and whatever was on the test, basically, is what they taught. And that's extremely short-sighted. And of course, nobody was forbidding you from teaching civics, but the pressures of that statute were such on local school districts that that was a predictable response and an unfortunate one.
So do you think that a simple solution might be, with the upcoming elections, to just continually ask that question of candidates so that it just gets into the public lexicon the way STEM does and has been? I think it's just part of it is it's being talked about a lot, and there's still debate about whether we're really going to need all those. There may end up being a glut of, you know, STEM graduates.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, that's just, I'd be surprised if we saw that glut, but I certainly think asking that question and being as specific, you know, figuring out what's going on in your state, you know, seeing what, depending what the candidate is, obviously. Being involved in local school board elections. The local school boards have tremendous power in most of the country. Some states run it very much at the state level, but there are local dimensions almost everywhere. And I think getting that issue up front and understanding what the value of the humanities is in both the hard-headed sense and also in the more community-based sense that we were talking about would be a big help. So yeah.
I know I interviewed the mayor of Manchester, and he said that he's putting great emphasis on the STEAM Ahead program, which is STEM with the added arts. So it's STEAM Ahead. Do you know if other areas are doing this, and what is the arts category that they're adding in?
Actually, I don't know the program, but it sounds great. And there is literature, I will say. Again, this sort of takes you back to this unfortunate position of trying to justify it by results. But the literature tends to show that the kids, for example, who are in the music program have higher grades than the kids who aren't. Now, who knows? I mean, I'm not going to get into whether there was self-selection to begin with, so they just happen to be those kids, or whether the discipline they learned. Having done music programs myself from the time I was about that high, you know, I did the clarinet, I did the piano, I ran a coffee house when I was in college, so I played a couple of stringed instruments. I then decided I really wanted to play the oboe and the English horn, so I switched over to them. So I've done a lot of different music as well as singing. And you learn a lot of life skills, so to speak, in those kinds of programs, just as you do, you know, if you do other kinds of cooperative endeavors. Other arts programs help expression. Interesting anecdote from when my daughter was doing her student teaching. She was trying to teach, this was a different school, a Chicago public school. She was trying to teach the Trail of Tears to these kids. And so they'd read, you know, the thing. They weren't really paying attention. But one of her other degrees is in art history, both undergraduate and a master's degree. So she found a bunch of paintings, and she just put them up on the screen. Boom, they were alive. They got it, they engaged in the subject matter, they had a good conversation about it. So people learn in different ways. And if you include the arts as part of the package that you're teaching them, you're going to hit some kids that just weren't going to respond as well to the other methodologies of learning. Get them to draw a picture, get them to, you know, do a skit, get them to do something. and it really reaches them. So it sounds like a great program, good for the mayor of Manchester. You know.
This is more of a comment than really a question. Full disclosure, I'm an engineer here.
I didn't mean to. So is my stepson. Actually, and I have a chemical engineer stepdaughter. So lots of engineers.
There's a program that was held here probably a little over a year ago by a National Science Foundation that was labeled "Becoming the Messenger," and it occurred to me, based on a comment you made before about how do we spread the word, and specifically with STEM, they had some stats saying that some school-age kids make up their mind whether to go into the sciences at a very young age, and how can we, delay some of those decisions until they have a further understanding of it. The program was incredibly effective about directing content and sending a message based on who the audience is that you're talking to, and they had an example there of the scientist in the white lab coat on the movies that I grew up with in the 60s and 70s. And certainly that's not the best way to promote something. And I also think now that this program from NSF was probably designed, I imagine, by people from the humanities because it was incredibly effective. And I'm wondering...
that communication thing again.
In a lot of different areas. I mean, they're saying, if we want to have, preschool kids raise their interest in STEM, how do we message to them versus, at the college level, which was another part of it as well, where they want to make sure, I think part of the motivation was they're investing all these dollars into the sciences. They want to have a broader impact, and how can we as scientists message out our accomplishments better so that they can be further utilized by others. And I'm just wondering if, maybe there's some efforts in the humanities to become a better messenger as well, and to look at how we're packaging this.
It's a great point, and one of the discussions that I didn't feel quite as much, a player in, but it was the problem, I'll say, of the humanities becoming enclaves only for the specialists. So if you were an historian, you just had your grad students who were studying to be future historians to fan out to various faculties around the country, and you didn't see yourself as making a broader pitch, so to speak, of what your field was to society. And I could go down every field you might want to think of, and just all these little silos of people, all the philosophers talking only to other philosophers. And the recognition that that's not the right way to think about it. And I know that in the science world, there's been, maybe it's not just this NSF thing, there's been a concerted effort to say, we need to get our message out to the rest of society. It's not enough to kind of sit there and competently do whatever it is we're doing. We need to communicate well. And the same surely is true of the people who are in the elite humanities faculties, who have not seen the need to do that, or at least haven't done it. So I guess they haven't seen the need to do it.
Could I ask a question about how something affects you personally in terms of your job?
Sure.
Okay, if you come from a humanities background, so other than perhaps being able to write better or use Latin phrases in the opinions, do you feel that your background gives you an edge over other federal judges? I'm not asking for names, but in terms of...
I wouldn't give them anyway.
Yeah.
So.
In terms of how you communicate or things like that, dispose of cases?
Every federal judge needs to learn, both at any level, district judges, circuit judges, Supreme Court justices, has to learn and obtain a comfort level with dealing with a huge array of subject matters. So for those of you who are not court buffs, again, in the federal courts, we hear all cases that we call federal question cases. There's a question of federal statutory law, there's a question about a treaty, there's a question about the US Constitution, and we hear all cases about state law if the people are from different states and the amount in controversy exceeds $75,000, which frankly nobody would bother to litigate if it wasn't at least that today, or at least most people don't. So we get all, state tort cases, state contract cases, property disputes, weird things about you built a pier and you destroyed my view. So you get all of that. You get huge numbers of employment cases, you get pension cases, you get bankruptcy cases, which are very complex sometimes to sort out. You get all these environmental cases. I've had cases where I've been trying to read reports from competing hydrogeologists because B's land has been invaded by a pollutant. And the question is, did the pollutant seep through the soil from A's land into B's land, or did the pollutant come in some other way? And so hydrogeologists will tell you, what the soil conditions are and all that. You can imagine, I'm sitting there reading these things and trying to ask myself, who's following a methodology that looks scientifically sound? Who is backing up their work with what appear to me anyway to be the right kinds of tests? Asian carp, any number of things going on there. So I actually started out thinking I was going to be a scientist. So when I was in high school, there was a National Science Foundation program that I participated in the summer after my junior year at the University of Delaware, in which I did a program in one of the professor's labs called Genetic Studies of Mycoplasma. So if you'd like to know about mycoplasma, I'd be glad to tell you. But it was a very good program because it was real lab work to try to figure out what these things were and how we could mutate them. I kept bombarding them with chemicals and x-rays and other stuff. And then I continued with that when I started college, took a bunch of science classes, and then I decided I didn't want to do that, so I changed over. So I like to think of myself as somebody who's not afraid of science. I have enough math, enough general background that I'll plunge in. I'm acutely aware that I'm not an expert in it, but you have to be willing to engage in the debate. I remember a case recently, I had some poor railroad worker who was on the front of the train, and it was raining, and it was a downward slope, and he was trying to throw a switch, and instead he went flying off the train because the door behind him flew open and knocked him off the platform. He was very badly injured. So had a big debate with my fellow judges on that case about whether, as a matter of physics, the door could have opened in quite the way that it did. Without him being negligent and failing to latch it, because he testified he did latch it. And then a bunch of other people said, no, these doors fly open. And it was a weighted closing, So I was actually sitting there drawing force vectors on a piece of paper, trying to brush up my old physics, which is really old. So you have to be willing to do it. You've got to be willing to play the game. And I think some people are more willing than others, and they're going to do better if you will engage. So, looks like that may be it.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Please stay and have some food.
Thank you.